Good afternoon, and welcome to this next episode of Governance Dialogues, a program that I have the pleasure to host. My name is Elisa Cole, and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center. And for those of you who are joining us to this program one more time, welcome. And you would know that we've been exploring a topic related to governance of big tech for the last several months. And this is a topic that continues to occupy headlines and attentions in the business community on both sides of the Atlantic. And we know that only last week, the US Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Alphabet over its alleged dominance of online advertising space. And of course, Elon Musk and its saga with taking Twitter private has also occupied attention, in particularly focusing, I think, on issues related to governance of Twitter. And we've been exploring these topics in several op-eds and publications, which are available on the website of Governance Center, and also in various episodes that we've put out on this particular channel, to which I invite you to subscribe. And in this episode, we'd like to continue this tradition of looking at governance of big tech, in particular, focusing on Facebook, which has, to my mind, slipped perhaps the radar screens over the last several months, with other developments at Twitter and Alphabet, but a company which currently counts, I think, around 43% of the planet and its users. And there's something interesting which has been brewing over the last few months, and that is a shareholder lawsuit against Mark Zuckerberg and the board of directors of Meta, which is what Facebook is now called. And I've actually invited on this program the very person who's filed this lawsuit, the shareholder lawsuit, to discuss what has been happening and to share with us the reasons why this lawsuit was filed. Richard Alexander is joining us from the US. He's the CEO of the Shareholder Commons, which is a non-for-profit organization which focuses exactly on that, protecting shareholder rights. So welcome to this program. Thank you for joining us from the US.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Yeah, a pleasure to discuss with you this lawsuit, which I personally found fascinating. I read both your filing and also, of course, the filing of Facebook lawyers, which we'll be discussing in a second. And of course, it would be very interesting to have your perspective, especially considering you've been practicing law in the US for many, many years. You've been, I think, selected as one of the leading corporate governance lawyers, and you currently serve, if I'm not mistaken, on the Delaware Corporation Law Council and also on the Council of Institutional Investors Markets Advisory Council. So you obviously have a very good picture of corporate law, and particularly corporate governance developments in the US. So perhaps the first question that I would like to ask you is really what prompted you to select Facebook among all big tech companies, which, as we know, have these multiple class shares and various governance failings, let's say, or challenges arriving from those. And why not Alphabet? Why not others? Why did you zoom in at Facebook?
So I have to give you like a little background about the organization to answer that question. So as you said, I had a 30-year career representing companies and investors and as a corporate lawyer. And I have since shifted, and I have run this small nonprofit called the Shareholder Commons. And it's a long story, but sort of that career led me to sort of this place where I formed this organization that we try to represent the interests of diversified shareholders, because basically we think that, capitalism is a great idea. You allow the profit motive and the, capital search for the highest returns to sort of help with price discovery and resource allocation. It's the Adam Smith idea. And that works great, except for this one little flaw, which is that companies can make a lot of money and so seem to deliver profits to shareholders in ways that externalize social and environmental costs. And so it's sort of like a false accounting, because a company doesn't have to account for its carbon emissions or its social, leading to things that doesn't lead to social dysfunction. But those elements that the company is externalizing come back to the shareholders, because most shareholders have diversified portfolios. Because that's the way you maximize your return as an investor. And so what our organization does is try to look at that and say, look, companies are not really we want to represent those shareholders and say, companies, you're not helping us. If you're delivering profits to us, but the way you're doing it is sapping the profits of the hundreds of other companies we own. So that's the background. And so that sort of leads me to your question of which is, well, why did we pick, Facebook has like changed its name to Meta now. And why did we pick Meta of all companies? And to some extent, it was fortuitous. We had been thinking about most of what we do is shareholder activism, not litigation. But we had been thinking that, one of the problems you run into when you go to a company and you say, as a diversified shareholder, we'd like you to stop externalizing these costs. They're hurting the rest of our portfolio. Is the companies might say, not our problem, our job, our fiduciary duty is to maximize returns to the shareholder. And, this lawsuit sort of says, well, that's not the right interpretation. But what happened in 2021 was Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, sort of, came out with all these documents, and she was an insider and explained exactly how the company was maximizing its value, but only doing so by prioritizing its profits over the interests of its users. And what we saw in all the documentation she brought forward was it wasn't just its users that were being subordinated. It was actually its diversified shareholders, because all those harms that impact the users of Facebook's platforms, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, Facebook itself, WhatsApp, all the things that it does that hurt them come back in the economy and hurt diversified portfolios. So we just thought it was a really well illustrated case of the problem we're trying to do.
And fortuitous moment, as you say. And the claims that you make are actually very interesting because they range from issues dealing with environment to healthcare, sort of like suicide rates and other sort of, let's say, negative externalities that have been alleged over time, and that, as you say, this whistleblower has helped you, let's say, uncover. And I wonder, for the purpose for our audience, if you could kind of walk us very briefly through the key allegations that you're making in terms of these negative externalities that you're putting forth.
Sure, it's very simple. And I thought I should make a clarification in case anyone's looking for the case. Like, it's not really a case that my organization, the Shareholder Commons, brought. We brought together lawyers and plaintiffs and some thinking and sort of helped to facilitate this. So it's actually, the case is called McRitchie versus Meta.
Exactly.
And look, everything in the case turned on this one key point, and this is all what came out of the whistleblower document. And the idea there is that Facebook thrives on traffic and engagement. The more users it engages, the more traffic going through its network, the more revenues they can get from advertisers. And so they very carefully tweak algorithms so that if you go on Facebook or Instagram, that you'll see a feed that is most likely to engage you and keep you glued to the screen, and therefore having your eyeballs on advertisements that they can sell. And what the Facebook whistleblower documents show is that when people internally said, hey, the way this algorithm is working, it's really raising the temperature in politics, or it's leading, it's being used to instigate ethnic violence, in Myanmar, or it's leading to drug cartels in Mexico, organizing around their Facebook Messenger feed. When all these harms were brought to the attention of management, and in particular to Mark Zuckerberg himself, the response was, well, we can modify to address those things as long as the modification, the algorithm, doesn't affect traffic. And so it's right there. And that's why she said they're prioritizing, it's very clear. And so that's and there's lots and lots of details around that, but that's the basic.
And I wonder, so now we're at the stage where you filed your suit, as you say, James McRitchie and against Mark Zuckerberg and the board, and the lawyers, and I think that's perhaps even the more fascinating bit, have filed their response. And reading that response makes for a fantastic reading. And I wonder if you could walk us through also sort of the allegations or the kind of the arguments the defense raises for Zuckerberg.
So they make some technical defenses that I'll a little bit skip over and say that the key part of what they respond to it. And so just a quick lesson in litigation. When you file a complaint and you say, we think that this other company or these individuals have done something wrong to us, they owe us a duty and they failed to do it. One thing that the person that you sue, the defendant, can do is say, even if everything they say is right, that doesn't create liability. We didn't do anything wrong, even on the allegations they said. It's called a motion to dismiss for failure to state a claim. And that's what they filed. So they basically said, even if it's true, even if all the things we outlined in the complaint and what we go through, this is how they failed. This is what they knew. This is what they failed to do to fix it. This is how that hurts the economy. And then this is how that harmed the economy, harms most of their diversified shareholders. So we walk through all that in the complaint. And what they say is, even if that's true, their only job as fiduciaries, the job of the directors and the officers as fiduciaries to the shareholders, their only job is to maximize the value of the company itself. So it doesn't matter if they're harming most of their investors by externalizing these costs on their diversified portfolios. So basically what they say is, it is not our job as fiduciaries to do anything except prioritize the interests of our shareholders in maximizing the value of their shares. And what's very interesting about it is it's completely contrary to the public stance of these big companies that we see at places like Davos and other places talking about stakeholder governance.
Absolutely. And in fact, that brings me to an interesting point about Delaware law. And obviously, this is sort of where you practice and which you know by heart. And I wonder to what extent, in their claim, in their file, in the response to you, they have this sentence that really sort of hit me. And it was something around saying that the plaintiff is portraying a version of or creating a version of the law such that it doesn't exist, but a version of the law that it wishes to see in practice. So not the real law, but a law that it wishes to see in practice. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the reality of Delaware law and how facilitating or accommodating or not it is to these types of claims, because we know that American law is very different than, let's say, the law in France or in Germany or in other countries in Europe, where there's been more of a concept of stakeholderism, UK, purpose of the corporation, et cetera, whereas in the US, that debate has been much more, let's say, sharp around partisan lines and more complex. So if you could say a few words about the law itself and whether it actually helps you to further your arguments.
So yeah, this is this argument about, it's been going on for 100 years. Is the purpose of a corporation just to benefit its shareholders and benefit its shareholders in a very particular way? Or does it have a broader sort of social contract and set of obligation? And in US corporate law, and in particular Delaware corporate law, which in some ways is the corporate law for all of the US, or at least it sets the precedent, it's been pretty clear that the corporation is run for the benefit of its shareholders, and that's the shareholder primacy view. There's a legal scholar, the late Len Stout, who really led a movement arguing otherwise. I think she did a great job from a policy perspective of pointing out the flaws of shareholder primacy. I think that unfortunately she went too far and said, therefore, shareholder primacy doesn't exist. When you look at the actual cases, again and again, the cases say that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize the value of the company for the benefit of its shareholders. But, and this is what's key to us, is we're focusing on those words for the benefit of the shareholders. So we think, of course, a company takes in capital, from these residual equity holders, and it makes sense that you're trying to to give them an optimal return. But when you start doing that in a way that is actually a negative for most of your shareholders because of their diversified portfolios, you're no longer maximizing for the benefit of the shareholders. And that's a question that the courts haven't really looked at. We think, if you look really hard at the precedents, there's some places where court kind of walks up to this question. And actually, we think reading those tea leaves they're read in our favor, not the other side's favor. So I would say this is more of a question of almost first impression, maybe for the court, rather than a question. The other side wants to say, well, because people have only interpreted this, in this narrow fashion, the precedent has been set. But what I would say is, well, the precedent hasn't really been set because people haven't been focused in this way. And what this case does, and I would say this is true not just for Meta, but for a lot of the big tech companies, is these individual companies have such a broad and deep reach into our global economy that they really set up the question in a way that you can't look.
Let me ask you sort of another question as to kind of what you're trying to achieve with the lawsuit. Of course, there's a kind of an awareness and other elements, but ultimately, when we look at governance of these companies, I mean, whether Facebook or others, they have similar, let's say, structural problems, at least in my perspective, in terms of the multiple voting shares and the fact that when other shareholders or stakeholders come to the table with proxy proposals, they basically get shut down. And I wonder what you think are the key, let's say, challenges or that you see in Facebook or other big tech, and what kinds of changes you would like to see at the end of the day, ultimately being made at the governance, in terms of the governance of these companies, in order to facilitate this kind of conversation around interests of diversified stakeholders.
So as I said at the beginning, like my organization, the Shareholder Commons, we're really focused on the interests of diversified shareholders. And so for the last few years, we've been helping people put in shareholder proposals, go to a company and say, just to like use a different example, like we'll talk about meat companies and how they use so much antibiotics in their supply chain. And by using all those antibiotics, they're able to expand their margins, lower their expenses, and deliver more profits to their shareholders. But at the same time, this overuse of antibiotics is really, really dangerous for the economy. I mean, hundreds of trillions of dollars of economic value are at stake if we can't get a simple operation without worrying about, dying from an infection. And so that's an area where we put in shareholder proposals to companies and said, we'd like you to, lower the use of antibiotics because it's good for your diversified shareholders, even if it lowers your own cash flow and enterprise value. And the pushback is always, well, that's not our job. And so from the broadest perspective, what we think is critical to not just helping shareholders, but really preserving like all of these systems is to refocus like how companies think about value. So that's what we're trying to do. And so then when you narrow in on a company like Facebook, where you sort of referred to this idea of they have this weird capital structure where one individual, Mark Zuckerberg, who owns maybe 10% of the equity, has 60% of the votes because he has these really high vote shares, 10-to-1 voting shares. So he's very concentrated in the company. He's not diversified. So his interests as the controller are actually different from the interests of the rest of the shareholders. So we would argue that in most cases where we put in most companies where we put in a shareholder proposal, we're trying to sort of do a mind shift where people understand where the value is. And if we achieve that mind shift, they can really push the company in a better direction. Facebook's trickier. So is Google, because they also have a similar, voting structure. And a lot of big tech companies have these voting structures so that the internal concentrated insiders can push the company in a direction that benefits them, but it's actually harmful to most of the diversified shareholder body. So that's a big problem we need to overcome. And we can overcome it with fiduciary obligation.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, I mean, you talked about a number of proxy proposals, and I'd like to come back to that in a second. But looking at big tech, I just want to sort of, let's say, close this part of the conversation. And you mentioned that that other big tech companies have similar problems because they have the same issue with the multiple voting right shares, which have extreme multiples, and this is something that a number of corporate governance organizations like the International Corporate Governance Network and others have been, let's say, critical of or fighting. But let me ask you, if you anticipate this claim is sort of a one-off situation, or might it be in your perspective kind of a door opener to other claims of this nature, where other shareholders come through and say, listen, we have these problems, and you can no longer hide between this very narrow interpretation of fiduciary duty that is only to shareholders, as it used to be the case.
Yeah. So I can see two outcomes to this motion to dismiss. But this is where, what we could look like. Let me just say, like, the court could say, well, no, the press, that's just a step too far. We're not going to go that. And like, I wouldn't like that outcome. But even if that happens, I think it could be very important, because it's already important that the other side has sort of put their cards on the table and said, well, we don't care about what happened. Sure, we care what happens to other people that affects share value. But if it doesn't affect share value, that we're not going to think about it. And that's
they were very clear about that. I have to say, it was not very ambiguous.
I think if people come to understand that, and if this case comes out, the way we don't want it to, it will very much help to advance the conversation that I think we're starting to have. And so that's one outcome. But to get more directly to your question, if we were to survive the motion to dismiss and the court was to say, well, it's reasonably conceivable, that's the standard, that there's some claim there, I think it would open the door to more litigation, but I don't think it would open the floodgates of litigation. And this is because there was also a doctrine in Delaware called the business judgment rule. And so if the court were to say, yes, boards can and officers can also consider the interests of their shareholders as diversified shareholders, that would expand the discretion that those fiduciaries have. But when they act within that discretion, they get the benefit of what's called the business judgment rule, which is courts don't second guess good faith decisions made by directors. So as long as they're considering everything and they're not sort of ignoring blatant red flags and they're not self-dealing, the courts are going to give them leeway. So you could see somebody, bringing the next lawsuit, against Google because, just like Facebook touches 3.5 billion people, Google touches like 4.2 billion people use their search engine. And they have their own algorithms that have their own problems. And so in the same way, you could see like a similar lawsuit if they weren't even considering these things. But once boards understand that they should be doing that, I think a lot of them will be happy. I think there was a move back in the 1980s and 1990s in response to the takeover boom to try to get companies wanted states to adopt these things called other constituency statutes that said you can consider not just your shareholders' diversified portfolios, but your workers as part of your fiduciary duties. And then that didn't happen in Delaware. So I think that in some ways, companies would embrace, success on our side. And there'd be a new kind of lawsuit you can bring, but I don't think it would really open.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And as a last question, I guess, because I have so many sort of issues that I would love to get your thoughts on, but for the purposes of time, I guess the last question that comes to mind is in terms of the timelines and what your expectations are in terms of going forward. When will we know as a public, what would be the final position of the courts on this matter, and what can we expect at the end of the day?
Yep. So as we've talked about a little bit, like in October, we filed our complaint, and they responded at the end of last year, at the end of 2022, we have an opportunity in litigation. I'm giving this little tutorial in Delaware litigation.
Yeah.
An opportunity to amend our complaint, and we did. We actually filed that last week. So we looked at their brief, and they made, I said, some technical arguments and some points about, well, you didn't support this and that. And so we had a chance to clean up the complaint. We've now filed an amended complaint, and we expect them to respond with a revised motion to dismiss and a brief in support at the end of March. And then we'll have a similar amount of time, 6 or 8 weeks, to file our brief back. And then the court will set an argument, and we'll, go to Wilmington, Delaware, and argue in front of the judge. And he'll, I think it could take in theory, up to 6 months, but I doubt it will. He'll do his ruling in a couple of months. And then there could be an appeal and things like that. But hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll have, or early fall, we'll have something from the court.
So that means by basically, first half of the year, we have some news on this very interesting lawsuit. And by end of the year, we will really know what position the U.S. courts will take. And it's also interesting if you kind of look at it or analyze this movement in the context of corporate law reform worldwide and sort of what's happening in France, what's happening in other jurisdictions who are trying to move slightly more to this kind of stakeholderism model, which has its also difficulties, let's face it, in terms of implementation. Like, how do you make board members accountable to this very diffuse and broad group of people? But it's an interesting. I found it a fascinating case, and I'd like to thank you for your time and in sharing your thoughts. And hopefully we'll do another follow-up interview on how the suit went. And perhaps some of the other proxy fights that Shareholder Commons is working on that you referred to in this conversation, which are also interesting from perspective of human rights, animal rights, and other causes that you're advancing. So thank you, Rick, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you to our audience for tuning into this episode. This is one more actually episode in the series that we're doing on governance of big tech. So please feel free to comment, share, and have a look at our website for further opinion pieces and articles on this topic if you're interested. Thanks for joining us.